in our second message on Satan. Who is he? What is he like? As with the first, we go to the Bible to answer those questions. And this time we look at Ezekiel 28 and verses 12 to 19. And we're going through that verse by verse, just briefly looking at what we can draw from each particular verse in that passage. Verse 12, it tells us you were the model of perfection. In other words, Satan was what we would call today a role model. One translation, Bible translation, puts it as you set the seal on perfection. Full of wisdom, it tells us, perfect in beauty. Contrast that with the usual hideous portrayal of Satan as a grotesque, sinister looking character with horns and a pitchfork. In fact, in 2 Corinthians in the New Testament, chapter 11, verse 14, it tells us that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. And so when we talk about Satan's ugliness, that ugliness isn't the looks or the appearance, but rather the character. It's a saying that people will often quote, don't judge a book by its cover. And no more is that true than when we start to think about Satan. So verse 12, you were the model of perfection. Verse 13, it tells us that he was in Eden, the garden of God. In other words, he was in the very presence of God. Eden is often used to describe utopia, heaven on earth. And so we find Satan right there in the very presence of God. In the Authorized Version Bible translation, it talks about tabrets and pipes. In other words, musical instruments. And Satan has often been described as the worship leader in heaven. And so there's often a sort of a thought, a line of thought that comes out from that. And certainly in today's society we can see how music is one of those areas and avenues that he works in, not only in a secular sense with some types of music which is very black and dark and obviously satanic, but also within the church as well. And I think when we look at church problems and you talk to pastors and you look back over the years, you see that music is often a source of real problems within church. And we can see from this idea of Satan being the worship leader in heaven, how if he wanted to infiltrate the church, if he wanted to cause problems in the church, then music is one of those areas that he can do that. And it's true that as we look and we observe, we see how music, rather than in some cases be an enhancement to the church, actually can be the stumbling block and the thing that causes problems along the way. Something to be wary of there, isn't it? Particularly for church leaders and those that have responsibility within church. The day you were created, in verse 13, we must never forget that Satan is only a created being, and the created can never be more powerful than the Creator. The one that is in you is greater than the one that is in the world. That's in 1 John chapter 4 verse 4. And we should never forget that, never be frightened of Satan. God is the one that is all powerful, not the devil. Verse 14, it tells us that he was anointed, ordained. In other words, this speaks to us of responsibility. Power can either make us or it can break us. Power can make someone either a great leader or a great dictator. And so we see how Satan had this anointing, this ordination upon his life, but in his case, rather than take him into a positive path, it took him actually into a negative path. And we see that, don't we, with power, when we start to give people responsibility. In a church setting, we give people responsibility, and then we see which particular path that they walk on, which is why we need to make right decisions in the first place. Verse 15, it indicates at first that everything was okay. Sometimes something new produces positive results, like the person who takes a new job, or they have a new car, they clean it every 2 or 3 days. They start a new church even. Lots of problems in the past, but they start a new church and everything's great. But after a while, the saying, familiarity breeds contempt, often comes through, and dissatisfaction creeps in. And Satan began to look not at what he'd got, but rather at that which he didn't have. And the message for us is to be content. Be content with our call. Be content with our place in life. Yes, we should be ambitious. It's good to be ambitious in the framework of God's will for our life. But above all, be content with where we are and what we have. Verse 16, filled with violence. What a sudden change it was. Compare that to verse 12. You were the model of perfection. Verse 16, filled with violence. But he tells us that God's judgment was swift. He drove him, he expelled him from heaven. Luke 12, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much will be asked. And so here we see Satan's true colours. I'm sure over the years we've all been in situations where we thought to ourselves, now we will see what that person is really like. And I have, like many others, I can remember actually saying to someone that now we will see your true colours. And we did. And this is what we find there in verse 16. A sudden change because we saw Satan's true colours. Verse 17, it tells us he became proud on account of his beauty. This was given by God in the first place. All of our talents and our abilities, natural abilities and talents, are God-given, and we must never forget that. And so we must not become proud in a sense of self-pride of things that God has given to us in the first place. Otherwise, we start to walk a very dangerous path, as we read here in Ezekiel 28. Verse 18, fire came out from you and consumed you. It's a true saying, isn't it, that people are often their own worst enemy. And Satan made a noose for himself. He stood up on the platform, he put it around his own neck, and he even pulled the lever. In other words, he was the one that was responsible for the path that he walked upon. And how it ended, we read there, verse 19, a horrible end, you will be no more. And again, to contrast that with verse 12, you were the model of perfection. Verse 19, a horrible end, you will be no more. Although this passage speaks to us about Satan, and we start to draw an image, a picture, some clarity from the Bible as to who he is and what he is like, there is also lots of things in there. There are also lots of things in there that we can draw from that keep us also on the straight and narrow in the life that we live.